On a June night in 1999, a group of drunken, partying teens in pickup trucks drove onto Wiebo Ludwig's farmyard in northern Alberta. Now, Ludwig was a notorious local figure. He was a charismatic evangelical preacher and eco-terrorist who operated from his Trickle Creek family commune. At the time, Ludwig was a suspect in a series of sabotage attacks on oil and gas installations. That night, the teens drove onto the Ludwig family compound and started stunting in their trucks, near a spot where Ludwig's grandchildren were camped out in tents. Someone, we've never known who, fired a gun at the vehicles. 2 teens were hit, and one of them, 16-year-old Carmen Willis, died. No one was ever charged in her death. The case sharply divided Alberta, and a surprising number of people rallied to Wiebo Ludwig's defense. Many rural Albertans who had despised him for his environmental extremism suddenly rushed to support him and to justify his family's right to protect themselves. I've been thinking about Carmen a lot, especially since Saskatchewan farmer Gerald Stanley was acquitted of shooting and killing Colten Boushie after Boushie and a bunch of his pals drove onto the Stanley farmyard and attempted to steal an ATV. Of course, the racial dimension changes things. Of course it does. When you look at the way the RCMP mishandled the Stanley investigation, treating Colten Boushie's First Nations family like suspects instead of victims. When you look at the way the trial was handled, especially given it appears all Indigenous would-be jurors were eliminated from the jury panel by the defense. And when you look at some of the utterly vile and hateful response on social media, it's clear Stanley's acquittal has exposed a deep and ugly fault line in Canadian culture. And I in no way wish to minimize the racialized elements of this case in drawing a parallel to Carmen Willis. But while Colten Boushie's death is symbolic of just how far we are from true reconciliation on the prairies, I think Stanley's acquittal is also a symptom of another malaise, a deep-seated belief that rural Canadians, especially on the prairies, have a right to shoot to defend their property. Stanley's lawyer didn't make a self-defense argument. He'd argued the shooting was accidental. But of course, the idea that a man could use a gun to defend his own property was implicit, even if unspoken. And it's easy to understand why. Let me tell you about the case of Eugene Dalton, a 62-year-old Alberta farmer from Chard, about 100 kilometers south of Fort McMurray. In July of 2014, 3 intruders came onto his property at 4 a.m. to steal his ATV. Dalton fired at one of them with a shotgun, hitting and wounding Philip Janvier. But Dalton was acquitted of aggravated assault and other charges and found guilty only of having an unlicensed shotgun. The judge ruled Dalton acted in self-defense. Now let me tell you about Brian Knight. He was a farmer from central Alberta who pleaded guilty in 2009 to criminal negligence causing bodily harm. He'd fired a 12-gauge shotgun at 3 drunken young men who'd come onto his farmyard at night to steal an ATV, wounding one of them. Knight was originally sentenced to 90 days, but his sentence provoked such a huge national outcry from people who insisted he had a right to defend his property. Eventually, the Court of Appeal reduced his penalty to a conditional sentence. And now let me tell you about Jerry Bigchild, a resident and member of the Sunchild First Nation in central Alberta. He too fired a gun, a .22, at a teenager he thought was stealing his ATV. The kid had also trespassed on his property at night. And a Red Deer jury found Bigchild guilty of careless use of a firearm, acquitted him of everything else, and gave him a conditional sentence. So, have we created a culture in which people think it's perfectly fine to shoot anyone who tries to steal your ATV? Have we normalized not just the right to self-defense, but the right to shoot to defend your stuff? Somehow I fear we've created a culture where rural people feel besieged and abandoned. On the prairies, they don't feel they can rely on the RCMP to help them. And by default, shooting at people feels like a legitimate response to trespassers and thieves. We don't just have a racism problem, though God knows we do. We don't just have a rural crime problem, so that's real too. We have a profound social breakdown where people feel so unsafe, so isolated, so undefended by the police that shoot first, ask questions later seems a justified response to intruders. And when the social contract breaks down that badly, we have a recipe for anarchy and for more heartbreak for families like Carmen's and Colten's.